Hi everyone, so this is lesson 4 on the Concerto Through Time topic, and this is actually the last lesson that we are going to spend looking just at the Baroque period. From next lesson onwards we are going to be examining the transition period from Baroque into classical and looking at what changed. So just a quick recap of what we've done so far. We've looked at the historical background and the sort of context to how a concerto came to being, and we've examined the difference between a concerto with just a solo instrument being accompanied by an orchestra and a concerto grosso, which had a group of soloists, the concertino, with a ripieno orchestra behind them. And we've looked at the instruments in the orchestra, we've looked at how it was string dominated, but also the other instruments around at the time in that period. We've looked at the importance of the basso continuo and the harpsichord and cello, most of the time, arrangement and how that worked and sort of underpinned everything. We've looked at ritornello form and how you had a ritornello section with everybody playing, alternating and contrasting with an episode with your soloist taking the lead, and just generally the way that in Baroque music you achieved these sort of light and dark contrasts between louder sections and quieter sections, and that was done through terraced dynamics and the number of instruments you had playing at one time. So we've covered a lot, which is great. And the final thing that we need to look at are Baroque melodies. So the learning points today are how Baroque composers developed and structured their melodies. And the second one is how ornamentation was used to decorate those melodies. And if you don't know what ornamentation is, then by the end of this video, you will. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about melodies in the context of the forward momentum that was achieved in the Baroque period and this very explorative style where composers were moving through lots of different chords and keys. So you had long melodies. They weren't broken up into short, neatly defined phrases. They were long, often overlapping, interweaving with one another, and that really helped give the music that sense of forward motion. Don't think, though, that that meant that the tempo was always fast. You could have very, very beautiful, slow tempos, but yet the melodies within those would have very long phrase lengths and would seem to just be unfurling and weaving through the music. Now, what's important to know melodies is that whilst they would be long, you would always have quite a concise and small theme that ran through them. So what composers would do would be to come up with a very short idea. So we could call that a theme or a motif, which is a word you're familiar with. Or sometimes it's even called a melodic cell. If it's just a very small idea, it might be, a pattern of 3, 4, 5 notes in a certain order, in a certain rhythm. And the composers would play around with that and they would develop those tiny little motifs. So there were many different ways that they could develop them, as well as, just standard repetition. And you've got a page in your CGP books. It's page create a melodic pattern quite nicely. So you might want to have a look at that. The technical terms that you need to be familiar with were an inversion, a retrograde, sequence, an imitation, and ostinato. So an inversion and retrograde were ways that you could take the motif and change it, but whilst keeping its sort of key elements. The inversion means that you would flip it upside down. So you have to imagine a horizontal mirror and you reflect the melody backwards. So if your melody goes up and then goes down, you would start on the same note, but you would go down and then go up. And you would basically follow the contour of the melody, but in the opposite direction. A retrograde, you've got to imagine your mirror is vertical and you are flipping your melody backwards. So you actually start with the end note and work through the melody as written, but starting from the end. So it's like from reading from right to left rather than left to right. So those were some quite interesting ways of developing a melody that went beyond just a standard repetition. A sequence is a very important term. Sequences were used a lot. And in your CGP book, you'll notice it says sequencing. Now that is incorrect. Sequencing is actually the act of playing music or importing music into a computer program and then editing it with software. So sequencing is another word for editing, basically. So do not write sequencing with an ing on your exam. It's using a sequence or applying a sequence or writing a sequence or sequences. And a sequence is when you repeat a melody, but you change the position of the melody in terms of pitch. So generally speaking, you go up by a step, but you could go up by a third or a different interval, or you go down by a step or down by a different interval each time. So importantly, you would have the melody repeated, I would say at least twice, probably 3, maybe even 4 times, and each time the melody is repeated, the starting note has changed. So you can have an ascending sequence where the starting note has been raised each time, and so the melody ascends, or you can have a descending sequence where the starting note is lower each time and it continues to get lower each time, and so that's a descending sequence and the melody descends. So sequence was very important. Ostinato, I'm going to jump to ostinato, is a word that you should be familiar with. We've talked about riffs in pop music, conventions of pop. An ostinato is a riff, but for classical music, basically. An ostinato means a repeating pattern. So, that's a very simple idea that you would take your little motif, little melody, and you would repeat it over and over again. Now, that might not constitute your main melody, but it might be something that's woven into your texture, perhaps even in the bass line. You've got something called a ground bass, which was where you had basically an ostinato, but you had one pattern that just went round and round and round for the entire piece. An ostinato doesn't have to last an entire piece. Theoretically, it could just be in a section, but it basically means a repeating melodic pattern. And finally, imitation. So imitation is one that you need to be careful with because it has 2 meanings, really. Imitation means you imitate, and I'm sure you all know that word. So it means it's very similar to a repetition, but it's not exact. And there are 2 different ways it is not exact. Firstly, you can write something that is imitative by changing it slightly. So you repeat a motif, you repeat a short melody, but you change it ever so slightly. Another form of imitation, though, which is very popular in the Baroque period, is that you would repeat a melody, but you would pass the melody around within the orchestra. So basically it would be repeated, but what would change would be the instrument playing it. And so therefore, in the whole texture of the music, where it was very popular to have these overlapping, interweaving lines, you would hear a melody somewhere and then it would be imitated in a different part, and then it would come back in the original part, and then it would go somewhere else, and it might be slightly altered or it might be exactly the same, but you would almost hear this sort of passing around, and again, that's going to help contribute to this sort of forward movement, this momentum. So for the purposes of the listening exam, OCR have never asked a question where they've expected a student to recognise orally a melodic inversion or a melodic retrograde. That would be extremely hard. It is possible that on the 2 questions on the paper where you get a bit of score, so you get some printed, notated music, it is possible, I suppose, that they could ask you to pinpoint an inversion or a retrograde, but it's never happened before, so I think it is unlikely. So we need to be familiar with what it means, but I don't think it's going to come up. What might come up is a more general question saying, in what way could a Baroque composer develop a melody? What melodic device could they use? And inversion or retrograde would be good examples, good answers. What you are going to have to be able to recognise orally is a sequence and possibly imitation. And sequences and imitation often go hand in hand in Baroque music because you will have one part playing a sequence. So you'll have a little idea that is then repeated and repeated and repeated, but each time it's repeated, the starting note ascends or descends. So let's say it ascends, which is probably slightly more popular. You've got your little idea going up and up and up, and it is then imitated in a different voice or in a different instrument within the orchestra. That's quite popular. And sequences come up a lot on the exam. They often do come up on the question that has a notated score, so you can actually see the blobs and the sticks going up on the score. Even if you don't read music, it will tell you what bars you're meant to be looking at, and you'll be able to see that the little melodic pattern is shifting up. It's being repeated, but each time it's gone slightly higher or slightly lower on the stave. Similarly, you should be able to hear imitation in a question on the exam because it's very recognisable when you can hear a little melody that is being passed about and you hear it in different voices or different instruments. I'm going to show you now what I think is a really good video, which is some Baroque music, and it's demonstrating imitation in 2 parts and then in 3 parts. So obviously this is being played on singular instruments, and we're looking at concertos where you would have the whole orchestra, but these principles would be happening within the orchestra. So you might have all of the strings playing a melody, all of the violins playing a melody, let's say, or the violins and violas, the higher strings, and then that same melody would be imitated by the lower strings, by the cellos. Then you might have the woodwind instruments playing a sequence, and then that might be imitated by another group of instruments playing a sequence. So imitation can happen without there being a sequence involved, and similarly you can have a sequence that isn't then imitated, but they do often go hand in hand. And this video shows you these very long interweaving melodies where you have got a sequence in the individual parts, but you've also got imitation. So as it starts, you've got imitation between what's being played in the right hand and what's being played in the left hand. So try and follow the score and also listen, and you can hear the little idea. Da 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 is imitated, and then it goes up in sequence. Da 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 da, it goes up. And further along, there is actually some examples of inversion. So the top line, da 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 da, that's a sequence. Da 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 da, that's a pattern, that's a repetition, but it's moved down, so that's descending. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. So da 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 is an inversion of da 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 da. So looking at the score, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So bar 8 is a melodic inversion of bar 1, but you wouldn't be expected to pick that out, because that's obviously quite complex and hard to hear. But what hopefully when you watch this extract, you will be able to hear the fact that these little ideas are in sequence, so that you can hear it moving up or moving down. And you will also hopefully be able to hear that it's being imitated between the different parts. Try and also just generally absorb how long and interweaving and explorative the melodies are. Okay, so hopefully you had a stab at following the score and were able to hear, if nothing else, the fact that you had these little melodic ideas, these motifs that were being developed through use of sequence, and that you could also hear those ideas being imitated and passed around different parts. And as the video went on, the second half of it, you saw that a third part joined in, and it also had very similar motifs and ideas that were sort of overlapping and interweaving. So a word that you have come across before prior to us starting the Concerto Through Time is texture and polyphony. And if you recall, it was also your homework on video 2 to have a think about what sort of texture might really suit the Baroque period, because they had these long, elaborate interweaving melodies, and the texture that we call that is polyphony, or it's a polyphonic texture, which means there are many melodic voices at one time, many voices, many sounds, polyphony. And there were specific ways in which you could combine voices, and we're not going to go into detail on that, but what you will need to be able to do is respond to a question on the exam when it asks you what type of texture can you hear in this extract. And if it's Baroque, it is very likely to be polyphony, or it's very likely to be a polyphonic texture where you have these interweaving melodies. And within those melodies, part of the way they are interwoven is by using imitation, so passing different ideas between them as they overlap one another. Okay, so that's the end of the first half of the video, where we've been looking at our learning point of how Baroque composers developed and structured their melodies. So I think perhaps it's a good idea to pause the video at this point and have a look at the worksheet and answer the questions relating to that part of the video, the first section, before moving on to the final part, which is all about how they decorated their melodies using ornamentation.
Here are some examples. A trill is just a wiggle between two notes. A mordant is like a mini trill, it's just one wiggle. Sometimes you have an inverted mordant that goes down. And a caccatura is a crushed note where the grace note, the added decorative note, is squeezed in as quickly as possible. An appoggiatura is when the grace note, the added decorative note, is half the length of the main note. A spread chord is where you're just playing the notes of the chord one at a time, but quite quickly. You could also go down. And a turn is where you sort of wiggle around above and below the note. This is J.S. Bach's aria from his Goldberg variations. It has a lot of ornaments. Follow the score and notice where the ornaments are happening.
Okay, so to finish off the video, I'm going to play you an example of a solo concerto by the composer Telemann. He was an early Baroque composer, and the solo instrument that plays is an oboe, which is the instrument that I play. So I like this one. I've played it myself. And the accompanying orchestra was just strings. So as we've talked about, the orchestras were always string dominated, but you could have woodwind and or brass instruments involved. But particularly the earlier ones would often just be for strings with a harpsichord. And so the extract that I've got for you actually has the score on the screen as the video goes through. So this is a still from the start, and you can see the instruments that are involved down the left-hand side. So you've got oboe, violin 1, violin 2, viola, basso. And so you'd have 2, 3, maybe 4 violins all playing the violin 1 part, 2, 3, 4 violins playing violin 2, a couple of viola players, and you would have a cellist playing the basso, the bass line. As you will see, if you just look carefully at your screen and you look at the blobs and sticks, even if you're not somebody that reads music and can interpret it knowing exactly what the notes are, hopefully you can see that there is lots of repetition. So there's lots of little ideas and little contours of the melody that are repeated over and over again. It's a very repetitive melodic line, and it's also got lots of fast moving notes all bunched up together. So it's quite a sort of complex and busy sounding piece. You can also see, if you look carefully at the score, that above the bass line, which would be played by the cello, you have got figures. So, of course, this is figured bass, and that is the system that the harpsichord player would use. So they would play the same part as the cellist, the bass part, the notes that are written in their left hand, but they would use the figures to help them determine what chords and what extra melodic stuff they should do over the top in their improvisation. So that's the basso continuo part. It's got the figured bass written out, and that is how the harpsichord would create their music. If you look further along, so the score will shift along and you've got more repetition. So I'm showing you here what it's going to look like in green. It just goes on and on and on, but it's sort of shifted higher. So it's a bit like a sequence in a way, because that idea from the first few bars is then repeated but higher up. And then finally you will see that the top line, which is for the oboe, starts having music, and you will hear the oboist come in. And as I've shown you on this screenshot, what the oboist plays is then imitated by the higher strings in the orchestra. So you hear it going da 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 da, and straight afterwards, just the little last bit of that phrase da 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 is repeated by the strings, and then the oboe takes it back again. So it's sort of passing that little idea da 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 between the two, between the soloist and between the rest of the orchestra. And this carries on as you go through the piece. There's lots of imitation, so passing these ideas around. And there's also some examples of sequence, and there's also some examples of ornamentation in the oboe part. So just listen to it and try and see if you can hear the oboe going da 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 da, hear it doing those little extra trilly bits, and try and hear the imitation between, so a little passage that the oboe plays that then the strings and the rest of the orchestra copies or imitates. Okay, so hopefully you were able to follow it at the start using the green lines, and then afterwards you were maybe able to keep going with following it. But if you didn't, don't worry. As long as you could hear that you had these long interweaving overlapping melodies, and hopefully you could also hear the imitation, that there was little ideas being passed around between the oboe and the strings. So first of all, the oboe would play something, then it would be imitated by the strings, and then back with the oboe, and then later on actually the orchestra would introduce a little theme that would then be imitated by the oboe. So the orchestra sort of took the lead. So hopefully you could hear that. And also you might have been able to pick out some ornaments in the oboe part. So there were little da-la, which is a mordant. And right at the end where we've just finished, there was a longer one, which is a trill. Da-la-la-la. So it's where it wiggles more than once. And a question on the exam would typically ask you to name one type of ornament that you have just heard in an extract. So the answer with that would be a mordant or a trill. And trills are probably the most popular one to go for, or a mordant. Turns were less popular. And a question might also ask you to describe the texture. So you would say polyphony. And it might also ask you to comment on a melodic device that has been used by the composer. And the answer to that would be imitation. So that is the sort of level of detail that you need to be able to go into. And hopefully that has given you a good understanding and sort of flavour for what Baroque concertos sounded like. And next video, we will be moving on to what happened after 1750 as the style started to change.